Thanks for joining us in 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. President Joe Biden and Speaker of the House of Representatives Kevin McCarthy met this week at the White House to try and reach a compromise on the looming debt ceiling crisis. You've probably heard a fair bit about this, but the U.S. could default on its debt in the next few days, which could set up a major economic crisis that not only affects us here in the U.S., but across the globe. For a bit more clarification about this and what it means for us, and we'll also get into some details about what it might mean for the average person as well, you and I. We're now joined by University of Denver economics professor Marcus Schneider. Marcus, thanks for joining us here again on 9 News Plus.
My pleasure, Chris.
So first of all, let's back things up a little bit before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty details. Remind us exactly what the debt ceiling is again and why we're so concerned about this.
Right. So the U.S. government and Congress specifically, has a slightly strange way of doing things where they approve their kind of general policy on taxes and raising revenue, basically determining their, if you want, their income stream. And then they have a different discussion to how to spend the money that they have. And then they have a third decision to make of if they spend more than they take in and therefore deficit spend and raise the debt, they periodically have to raise that debt ceiling. I think of it as imagine having a credit card and deciding you're going to spend whatever discretionary funds you have on any given paycheck, but there's something you want to purchase that you need to put on that card because you don't have enough in the bank. If that card is near maxed out, then you got to go to the bank and talk to them about raising the limit. The difference being is that Congress makes all three decisions, which we typically don't, right? We don't decide our income that directly. We make the spending decisions, and it's up to the bank to decide whether or not to raise our limit, but Congress makes all three of those decisions. And this is the one we're facing now, is the limit one.
You mentioned that it's unique that the U.S. does this. How many other countries in the world have their legislative body vote on whether or not to raise the debt ceiling?
You know, I actually don't know, but I am under the impression that very few have separated these processes, that you would decide on spending separate from the ability to borrow the money that you would need to spend.
I'm going to put that on my resume, Marcus, that I stumped an economist. I assure you, I'm not nearly that smart, and I rarely do that. But in this case, I think I know you're absolutely right. I kind of asked that question because I know this. I don't think any other countries or any other developed countries that do this. It's a unique system. But with that said, you kind of alluded to this as well, how the debt ceiling has stayed below its limits, and that I know that the Treasury Department has kind of gone to extraordinary measures to keep that debt ceiling under wraps for the moment, but obviously those emergency measures can't last forever. So what has the Treasury Department been doing in order to keep the debt ceiling at bay in the time being?
Actually, I also am not quite prepared for that question. Sorry, you're catching me off guard here. This is 2 for 2. You know, the Treasury has a lot at its disposal that it can do to sort of rearrange debts and rearrange how it pays things, but eventually those things run out, right? If we think about the Treasury is what issues currency and that, yeah, eventually there's only so many ways that you can rearrange the decks on the Titanic, right? The deck chairs on the Titanic before the crisis looms.
So, I mean, I'm asking, those are fairly specific questions just to kind of set the background. The really important thing that we kind of care about is what this could mean, obviously, if we default on our debt in the coming days, in the coming weeks. This is really the question I think that matters ultimately to you and I and to everybody out there. So what would it mean if we default on our debt? Has that ever happened before?
It has not happened. Apparently, there was a very brief period where, due to some technical issues, some debt holders were paid late in the 1970s and 1979, but that was not the same as an actual default. An actual default of U.S. government debt has never happened. And that's important for two reasons. One is just, you know, if a creditor defaults on their debt, they are seen as less reliable, and therefore their borrowing costs go up, right? If your credit rating is not stellar, then you're going to pay a higher interest rate. So US government borrowing costs go up. That's the first kind of implication here. But the second one is that US debt, because the US has never defaulted and is obviously a major economy in the world, its debt is actually seen as a safe asset and a sort of a benchmark of what a safe asset looks like and what the return that you can get as an investor on a safe asset is, which means all kinds of other financial assets that are riskier are priced with that as a benchmark. And so defaulting on our debt upsets that entire logic of how financial assets and risk premiums are calculated. And that's the other part of the risk here, is that has the potential to throw financial markets into quite a bit of turmoil as people figure out how to reprice those things. And then the third level is that, the effect on us as individuals is if the borrowing costs for something considered as safe as the US government go up, certainly our borrowing costs are going to go up as individuals and as households in the US, households and firms in the US.
Interesting. So that would raise a lot of those borrowing costs, which would obviously be a downward effect, and perhaps I would imagine also lead to the potential to trigger a recession or worse, and something with global implications as well, Marcus?
Absolutely. So Moody's has a projection out, and I think this is actually probably optimistic. Their projection is that we would see a 4% contraction in GDP, which is pretty major, looking on the order of 6 million lost jobs through that, which effectively would translate into doubling the unemployment rate that we currently have. Now, I think other projections are much more dire, and people are talking about a crisis on the level of the Great Recession, so the 2007 to 2009 economic downturn coming out of this.
So does it matter, let's say, for example, we start defaulting on our debt, does it matter how long we default on our debt on? Let's say you mentioned how in the 1970s there was a brief period where there were some unpaid debts. Let's say it lasts a couple of days, or perhaps it lasts a couple of months. Is there a big difference in terms of how that impacts us?
I suspect yes, but this is where we get into really kind of the unknown territory, right? Because this has never happened. And actually we're, even though now we've seen some debt ceiling crises in the past decade or so, one of the things is that financial markets may be overestimating the chance of this being resolved last minute, because that's what happened when this occurred in the 2010s. So that means if we default, they're going to be caught off guard. And if it's a short period, a couple of days, maybe they're willing to sort of sustain that. We'll see some jitters. The longer it lasts, the more it will hit home of the impact of this, and the more severe the crisis will likely be. But this is where a lot of uncertainty just comes in.
So is there anything that you and I, average people, can do to prepare for that potential for this to take place? Is there anything we can do?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the reality is probably there's limited things we can do. Perhaps the most successful thing would be to call your representative and let them know how you feel about this, whether this worries you, and were to get their guns, but were to stick to their convictions on this, or what you would like to see in terms of resolution. But one of the problems of systemic downturns, so crises that are caused by things the government does or things that happen in financial markets that are beyond us as individuals, it's relatively difficult to do something short-term to prepare for that, right? I mean, hopefully we have some savings, but if we're talking about major job losses, those are not going to be under our individual control. And I think that's the scary part here.
It seems very plausible. And I haven't asked you about of course, the chances of this being resolved because, Marcus, it's a political question, right? It comes down to the Republicans and the Democrats kind of figuring out a deal on this. And obviously, you're an economist, so it'd be unfair for me to ask you what are the chances of this being resolved. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I honestly sort of don't particularly know it. One of the write-ups I recently read, compared this to a game of chicken. I think to some extent that's right. Brinkmanship is the word that also gets tossed around a lot. But what we kind of know from economic theory, and this is something that I teach, is sort of the game of chicken is a little problematic to analyze. In the kind of best case scenario, you have two qualitative scenarios. One is that one or the other driver swerves, but it's very unclear who does. And in this situation, I don't know who's going to swerve. Or there's just a kind of chance that they both swerve, reach some compromise with some give on both sides. But that also predicts that there's a chance that neither of them do, and we have a crash. And I think there's actually a decent chance of that in this political climate. Anyway, I don't have a concrete prediction there, even though I have some tools for thinking about it.
Yeah, well, certainly fascinating, if not a little, certainly unsettling to say the least. Any final things to add about the debt crisis and the debt ceiling crisis and what it might mean for us?
One thing that's a little bit encouraging on sort of that last question, right, is that it looks like there's a little bit of give on the Biden side in terms of reclaiming stimulus funding. And I'm hoping that that hints at some willingness to actually find a compromise. Now, what's tricky here is that what the other side is demanding is really a repeal of core agenda items that Biden has fought for very hard. And I think that's just a non-starter, and probably rightly so. I think also McCarthy is in a very tough spot. I mean, we all know that he had a very tough fight to become speaker. And I think there's a block of the Republicans who are going to very much hold him to account to try and follow through on promises that he made. And I think that's the thing to think about here. And that's where I think the idea of actually calling and talking to our representatives is probably where we can have the most impact.
And for clarification, we need just a simple majority in both the House and the Senate to get this passed and the debt ceiling raised, correct?
Correct.
So it's not 2/3, it's not 3/4, which could plausibly, and I know we're venturing into more political grounds here, but for those of you joining us out there to know, you need a simple majority, so 218 votes in the House of Representatives, 51 or 50 plus a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. Which could also, on the flip side, mean that if you get, I think it's what, 5 defectors, so to speak, from the Republican caucus to join Democrats, you would have the majority there as well.
Correct.
So
you'd be able to, yeah. And this is, it's very uncertain political times, right? Because the Republican Party is somewhat fractured in these ways where they have definitely some representatives in the House who are uneasy with the budget proposal that has been passed in the House and the cuts that it implies. And you have obviously a very vocal set that are very hardline about insisting on those cuts.
I believe there were a couple of House Republicans who said they voted to pass the one resolution that did pass, but I believe it was Nancy Mace from South Carolina who said that she knew that there was no chance of it actually going through, so that's why she voted for it.
Correct.
And again, to be clear, we're obviously venturing a little bit here into the political side of things, but I think, Marcus Schneider, appreciate your insight here on the economic side of things, which is kind of setting the table for what could happen and the potential implications of that. So thank you so much for taking the time to explain that to us here on 9 News Plus. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks again.